So then, we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzaielic lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end as per Yirmiyahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yirmiyahu the prophet, it's very important making establishment of the basis of prophecy. Surely, every prophecy found in a holy Megillah of the instructions must trace back to the Torah or the instructions. But let's then verify if we understand who the Messiah was and what was his objectives. Firstly then, we read in the 24th chapter of Mitchiyahu, because he was then a Levite, very acquainted with the services of the temple. Then the Messiah himself, he was then obviously in the region of the temple area. As we can understand, he was there with his Shilishim or disciples. But let's then make sure we maintain the original manuscripts and the wordings used in the original manuscripts, so we don't then drift away from the holy instructions and ended up with a mountain made out as a city, thinking that the holy city then was built in the United States, for instance. Because if we drift away so far from the holy instructions, we ended up building homes underground and trying to live like reptiles. But from the holy instructions, let's then verify if we then maintain the original path, so then we can understand the instructions and also who the Messiah was, because it's very important. Because from the prophecy of Yirmiyahu the prophet explaining then the first holy city on the land of Cush versus then what the United States has built in the Ozarks, a city over there underground with the 12 gates, there is a huge distinction from an understanding of the original manuscripts versus then the Greco and the Roman translations. But let's then make sure we understand the simplicity of these instructions based from a time after the Messiah came back from the dead. Then many ask, why then we don't have the records of this entire year the Messiah spent with his people? You don't have the records because at the end of his 12 months, he then laid it down, the information regarding the existing time they were living in, and they were in prosperity. They didn't like very much the idea of this world being destroyed, and we should then further on the instructions via his tabernacling piece of the holy instructions. They were confused, they didn't understand. But what they wanted very strongly was the prosperity of the time. These they truly wanted, and then they got rid of any portion of the scripture they didn't understand. But then the simplicity of it, the Messiah did spend a year with his people, because he was then reteaching them how to maintain the holy feasts, or the Moadim. Now, if you think you have so much in your life and you should not study the Torah or the instructions, and you don't think the feasts are relevant today, then you won't ever understand the holy instructions. And quite frankly, if you spend an amount of time in some sort of a congregation speaking of a translation that doesn't exist, then it's a simply waste of time. Because what is the objective of studying the holy instructions? Is the salvation of the soul of the person. You're not only there only to make a statement for somebody else while you yourself exclude from the holy instructions. If you do this, then your soul is lost upon death. So then, the Messiah spent a year with his people. In the 24th chapter of Mitchiyahu, you understand what he was doing. He was there near the temple over there, speaking and making sure his people would understand the holy instructions. And if you read, for instance, what the people were doing to him during this time, he was over there, and then his Shilishim drew near and were showing him the construction of the temple. So then, were then these Shilishim explaining the temple as if the Messiah did not know? Because we must explore a bit what he was doing and then his disciples were doing. Did the Messiah know regarding the temple? At this stage, in the point in time, obviously. But what made those people, his disciples, showing him the construction of the temple? Can you understand the word construction? Can you understand the word infrastructure? They were speaking of construction. Let's read it again. And his disciples drew near and were showing him the construction of the temple. They were during the time of a great prosperity. There were constructions everywhere. And obviously regarding the situation with the temple, there was some sort of a project going on near it. So they were during the time of prosperity. And what was the response of the Messiah? Then he said, the Messiah then said to them, "Behold, don't you observe these?" And then he said, "Truly I say to you, not a stone is going to be left upon another." So the Messiah then was absolutely 100% on the other side of what they were wishing for. They wanted to proclaim the prosperity near the temple as a new time of restoration period. The Messiah said, no, it's not the time. So can you understand when the person then understands the holy instructions and begin then explaining these situations for what they are? Do you understand how upset people get? Don't think for a moment during the time the Messiah was explaining these layers, they were angry at him. Because they wanted the prosperity, they wanted what they wanted to do, and they want the Messiah to go along with them. And the Messiah said, no. It's not going to work this way. And they were angry at him. And let's continue on. Then he said, not a stone is going to be left upon another, and every one of them should be torn down. And then while the Messiah was on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and then drew near and were saying amongst themselves to him, so then, say to us then how this coming of the end of the world and your sign is going to be. They were kind of making a bit of a fun out of it. But they were saying behind what they were thinking. He was explaining then, besides this prosperity we are living in during this time, what's going to be like in the future that's going to match or becoming more than we have at this point? They are having prosperity and money in their minds as the primary God of their lives. And every time they want to trick him to go along with them, he said, no, it's not the way it's going to be. Then what did he say? And the Messiah said to them, be aware and don't be deceived. What he was saying was precisely the contrary of what his people wanted. And we are not talking about the regular people, we're talking about his own disciples. Can you imagine the desire of the regular people for more of prosperity? It was far more than what his disciples wanted. If you understand this point, when the Messiah came back from the dead, he spent a year with his people. Can you find the Gentiles around the Messiah asking questions? Verify if you find, if you know how to make the distinction from pre-12 months he spent with his people versus post-12 months he spent with his people. If you can make the distinction, can you find regular Gentiles asking him questions? You don't find, because they were busy being prosperous. Then the Messiah said, be aware, don't be deceived, because the people are already deceived, the regular people are deceived, the Gentiles are deceived. Now you then, being the Shilishim, or then the disciples, you are also deceived. It's not going to be the way you wanted. And then the Messiah started explaining. For many will try to come in his name, and said, this person is the Messiah, the other person is the Messiah. Why? Because the prosperity was on the land. The problem with prosperity is people have no restraints. And then people began to interpret the way they want, as the disciples and the people of his time. They were deceived with the riches and prosperity, and they want him, the Messiah, to do what he then said regarding what the kingdom of heaven would give them, but the time was not as it was then explained on the prophecies. It wasn't the time. But they wanted to make it so, and the Messiah said no. Then he goes further. Then he was explaining, and you can be sure of it, when he was explaining this prophecy, they were not interested. He was explaining these as an obligation, because there was a situation regarding pieces of prophecies that must be then completed. But they didn't like it. Then he was explaining many other situations, and many they will to deceive. So the Messiah, ever since his people came to him for an explanation, until he began to talk of prophecy, he was only speaking of deceit. You people are deceived. You Gentiles are deceived. They weren't even there. And what the Messiah was saying is, because of the prosperity that the Messiah himself brought, they didn't do any work for it. The Messiah was there, and he brought prosperity on the land because of what he did. Yet they were trying to take a hold of what he brought and take upon themselves the credit of doing so, and forcing the Messiah to go along with their plan. And the Messiah said no. Now, if you go to a church and you begin to say, church is a fraud, never existed, it was made up by the hands of man. The basis of having a church is because of taxes not being paid. How are they going to react? And you know it is true. So then the Messiah continued. Then he started, for you are bound. Then the Messiah gave an order. Can you understand? After the gibberish junk they wanted, then prosperity, and they were talking about the construction of the temple and some other situations, and then the Messiah did not go along with them. And the Messiah said, you are bound. You can go along with what you want, but we must understand the Holy Torah. So then you understand what's taking place. You are bound. The Messiah was saying you have no choice. You hear of war and rumors of wars. Watch out and do not be disturbed, for it is required that you go through these situations. But the time is not yet. Then he explains further on. They were not interested. Not even a bit of it. Now, when speaking of prophecy, people, they think when they speak precisely what then we find in holy instructions, people simply don't like it. Because people are evil by nature. And when speaking of the light and reality of the holy instructions, then the people, they don't want to get near it. They want prosperity to do what they want. That's why the Messiah then was giving them a scolding. Then he explains many situations, but we are during the time of, but it is not the time yet, or it is not yet the end. Then there is a gap there. Now, when we read the holy instructions, for instance, Leviticus, you understand those are the holy Moadim, the holy feasts. When he was reading the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu the prophet, he only read half of it. Now, if we don't know how to make those distinctions of what to read and what time in the season is, and then what we should not read because it's not the time yet, then we don't know how to navigate through the holy instructions. And the ignorancy of not understanding these brings us to the only one objective only: prosperity. Because people don't understand the holy instructions, they don't want to understand the holy instructions, then they say to themselves, be prosperous, God is with you if you are rich. Precisely what the Messiah was explaining. They were rich at this time. They were doing some construction of the temple over there, some refurbishing. Then he was there explaining, and those people, they want him to go along with them. And he said no. Then the Messiah went on. It was explained in sections of Daniel the prophet. Now, let's evaluate a piece of prophecy. And this great news of the kingdom wilt be preached in the world as a testimony of the nations, and then the end shall come. And when you observe the sign of the dirty situation regarding the desolation spoken of Daniel the prophet, then you understand then the set apart. You understand tabernacling. At this time they did not have any clue, because they were not interested. They wanted prosperity for themselves. They wanted the same time as the king of Shimon, or king of Israel, was then doing on the land during his reign. Lots of prosperity. They thought during this time when the Messiah came back from the dead and spent 12 months with his people were the time that then God promised, as he promised David. They didn't understand, and they were not interested. So this portion of the holy instructions went obscured for centuries. Then came a time when the Messiah, then there are some pieces in Acts of Ruach HaKodesh, then you find the Messiah, then he ascended. Then there was persecution on the land, because the Messiah said then at the very end, prior of his ascension, he said, you people are deceived, precisely as he was saying then in 24th chapter of Yeshayahu. But the excitement of the moment was so great, they wouldn't have even time to write it, because trade was in its extreme, and then they were having trade and they were buying and then having items for for selling and coming in and going out. There was so much going on the land. And prior to his ascension, he said what he saw then down there in those 72 hours of his experience in Chile. Then he explained it, and they were angry. Then he ascended. And then they went around picking up every piece of scrap of information of the Messiah, and they burned it. They destroyed it. Because they knew for sure on their own understandings this was the time of the restoration, when then Israel would reign in the world. And the Messiah already said it. No, it's not going to be this way. And the persecution was so severe that the last of the Shilishim, Yohanan, ended up in Africa. That's why the Shilishim went so far. He had to go down there in northern Africa to get away from the cities of Asia Minor. And then the prosperity went on. As you can understand, let's talk regarding Shaliach Shaul. He was then one of the first persons who did understand times and the seasons based from the Moadim. As he was explaining in Asia Minor, then Ruach HaKodesh obviously helped him and his people, and then in Asia Minor they began to work together, and then observing the tactics, or then the ways of doing trade via then what heaven is teaching them. That's why the Asian countries are so prosperous. Where was then Shaliach Shaul doing most of his teaching? In Asia Minor. And then during this time, then you find sections of Revelation, or then Yohanan, what he saw. As Yohanan was in northern Africa, and they had built then the first holy city, as per the instructions of Moses, and the completion of what the Messiah did, and they were expecting then the work to be done, so then they were awaiting for the autumn feast. Does it make sense? Sure it does. You have then the laws of Moses that were then given in the desert. Then for 1,000 years then his people were training. Then the Messiah came, completed a half of it. Then there was prosperity on the land. Then the people of the land, evil as they were, they obviously kicked out those people out of the land. The Shilishim ended up in northern Africa, where they formed the first holy city. From then on, those Megillas, the instructions of those sins that were in Asia Minor with those 7 cities were sent, they were straightened out, and then there was prosperity in the land for 1,000 years. Then, during the time of Shaliach Shaul, let's talk regarding another situation. When we read Acts of Ruach HaKodesh, what do we find regarding the works of Shaliach Shaul? Acts, for instance, explain a few sections of the dispensation of the Spirit given only to those who are from the lineage at this point in time. Then later on, Shaliach Shaul was in many cities proclaiming that the spring feast was completed. That's the only situation he was concerned with. Mentioning his people everywhere they were, the spring feast was completed. Half of the holy instructions were completed, and half of it must come yet, and it is the autumn feast. Gentiles don't understand, and if they are against it, at the end, when they breathe their last, their souls go straight down in a Sheol, torment, until this age then ends. People don't like as much as they are liking at this moment as it was during the time of the Messiah. People want what they want, to do their evils, They hide their evils and they want to enjoy their time on the earth. And the Messiah said no. He was explaining to those people who were his disciples. If he was saying these to his disciples, can you imagine the other people being Gentiles? How much work they have to work themselves to understand the holy instructions, to renew their minds, to understand the holy prophecies, and then becoming near as the disciples, and then yet they were rebuked for wanting prosperity on the land on their ways. Now the Messiah is not going to lead you if you don't study the instructions. And if you think you can be led from this world of contaminated sins, then simply you are crazy. As much nice as a person as you are, at some point you have to study the holy instructions. Shaliach Shaul. The holy instructions, when they were translated from the original manuscripts and the prophets, and then they translated from Greco-Romans to others and other nations. But when the Greco and the Romans were translated from the Hebrew or Aramaic, they didn't understand what they were doing. However, there was excitement on the land because of prosperity. And the Messiah brought it. Some examples, for instance, Cornelius. He was a centurion and also a scoundrel. Why he was a scoundrel? Because he never saw an angel. He was never on the top of the house over there praying with the others. Gentiles were not invited to pray with the Hebrews. Okay, let's make sure we understand. Those Hebrews, when they were gathering around, they were simple, they were humble, they were praying, they were receiving understandings. They were not shouting, they are not partying, they were praying. As Cornelius then saw from afar, he saw that there was real situations going on amongst those people because they did have understandings from heaven. Didn't say God was amongst them. It said they were receiving understandings from the instructions. They were understanding more of the prophecies. They were directing people. They were leading. And himself, as a leader of 100 men, then he was interested. He wanted to lead the way those Hebrews humbly they were leading. And he did not know what to do, so he began to observe. Then the Hebrews, they used to take what they had, were given to those unfortunate people, and he saw what they were doing. And he began to do himself. Then the Hebrews were observing him, and he had a position of authority of some sort, and they were pleased, the Hebrews were pleased that this person had some understanding of the Torah. They should be concerned with the unfortunate. And then he would not be with them, but he would be somewhat far away from them, but very in tune with what they were saying. Then someday there was an understanding amongst the Hebrews over there, and there was a word that came out of their prayers. And they simply said, Cornelius, what you are doing then is noted. That's it. Cornelius interpreted as he received a word from heaven. And he inflated himself so much that when they translated the documents, those translators, let's make sure we understand, then put this centurion, this Cornelius, then on top. He saw an angel from heaven. Can you understand how contaminated the scripture can get? He didn't have any vision. He was not part of the Hebrews praying. He didn't do anything. He was an outsider, a Gentile. But he interpreted as noted as if they had an understanding from heaven given to him. When a person has an understanding from heaven, the first portion comes if you read the Torah and the prophets. The Hebrews said, what you are doing is noted. They did not say your work is noted by heaven. They didn't explain very much because he did not have the understanding of heaven. That's why he inflated himself so badly to the point of saying he was praying up there as they were doing, and then he saw a vision from heaven. He was a scoundrel and a liar. And then the Hebrews also said, however, since you are a person that wants to take orders, you go over there and visit with Shimon in Joppa. That's it. Plain and simple and direct you can ever get. And then he went. Now, comparing how far away Gentiles are from the original manuscripts, can you understand how much of the Gentiles they make up stories for themselves? Cornelius was a scoundrel. He never had a vision from heaven. Those translators, because there was so much prosperity on the land, they were so excited what was going on. When they were translating, they were exciting themselves even further by saying, oh no, these Gentiles, these Cornelius, then let's put him on top. Because we are the ones that we are taking the lead of construction, we are doing these and that and the other. And the Romans were lots of constructions going on, but brought by the Messiah himself. Then put this person on top. So the translator did. And those who understand the Holy Instructions today say, this guy had nothing to do with it. Another situation is with Shaliach Shaul. At some point, he was then teaching and showing his people the spring feast was completed. And then there were handkerchiefs and rags that were taken from Shaul and then placed on the sick and they were healed. It's absolutely a lie. You don't ever take a piece of cloth from a person, places on the sick, and the person then is healed. Never. Once again, the land was excited because of what was going on in trade and prosperity, and those people who were watching, they thought of mysticism. You don't take a piece of cloth from Shaliach Shaul and by mystical prayers you place in somebody then get healed. He doesn't. The same situation when then those Hebrews were praying and then Cornelius saw is the same situation with the others. These Greco and the Romans, when they were translated, they want to make it mystical. The same way they made a mistake of saying Cornelius saw a vision from heaven, an angel, the same way the works of Shaliach Shaul were then scandalized to make it sensational. Next time I'm going to read more of these. So then we have a nicer understanding of what's going on and then what the Messiah did. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.